Hello, my darlings. Madame Raven here with a short story for you by Coreyursine, entitled Family Ties, Part 1. Like many displaced children of Scotland, I had saved up for most of my life to buy myself a ticket and get my passport to check out the land of my ancestors. I had searched across websites, emailed record keepers for small Scottish towns, Skype called distant relatives across the ocean to see if they had any way to further my search. Eventually I tracked my lineage down to a first cousin of Bonnie Dundee himself, John Graham of Claverhouse. So I packed up my bags. My passport was stamped. My phone loaded down with music as my flight left my Kentucky home to head to Edinburgh. It turned out to be a hell of a lot more exciting trip than I thought it would be. Scotland was beautiful. I went on the tours of Edinburgh, took a weekend trip to Glasgow, and then finally started doing the hard work of tracking down where my family came from and seeing where my ancestors had lived, fought, and died. I looked at the castles where battles had been planned and men promised as support, where the people of Dundee had barred the doors to the soldiers who were fighting for the Jacobite cause in 1698. It was all quite strange to see places that looked like they'd been untouched by time since the historic events that had happened, almost like they had happened the day before, and I would see the Highlanders come marching down the pathway in the fog at any moment. The last stop on my trip was the battlefield of Killiecrankie. The Jacobites had won the battle, but it was where the man who was possibly my most famous ancestor had lost his life. The drive was long, foggy, and rain sprinkled on the windshield of my rental, off and on the entire way. I hummed snatches of songs as I drove, not really paying much attention to the lack of cars that I saw as I traveled the roads. I parked off the side of the road and walked onto the historic site, awed by a feel of reverence for what had happened in the 17th century, where I was standing now. I wandered around for what felt like hours, climbing small rolling hills and looking down on the ground just below me, reading from my notes about how the forces had been arrayed, how the men had defended, charged, forced their way through Mackay's forces, how John Graham had been finally shot from his horse and died on the battlefield. Eventually I sat down on a slope to eat my packed lunch, munching on a sandwich as I began to write in my notebook about the experience so far. I still didn't know if I lost track of time or what, but when I looked up from my writing, it was close to 7 in the evening. The gathering dark filled the area with flickering shadows and the strange noises of nighttime. As I began to pack my things and rise, a soft voice spoke behind me, and I turned to look, startled and heart beating 1,000 miles a minute. "A visitor," the man said, his face sad, the eyes sunken and sad. He was dressed like a reenactor, complete with curled and powdered wig. A thick and heavy tartan was wrapped around his body, stained and torn in places, but still vibrant, and slightly moving with the wind that I didn't feel. His hand rested on a sword hilt that hung at his waist, and he looked at me as he continued his spoken thoughts. "We rarely get visitors anymore to this part of the land, at least this late at night." I stammered and tried to think of something to say, to tell him why I was here, what I was doing, but he merely waved a hand at me and pointed toward the field before us. "My men, they gather. After all these years, the men of Bonnie Dundee gather for their commander." I felt like wind was howling past my ears. and the ground seemed to rush up to meet me. As I began to pass out, I heard the ghostly noise of battle drums and creaking harness from the hillside as the Jacobites marched towards their leader. So quoth this raven.